Hi, everyone. As you're coming in, please let us know where you're tuning in from. I'm sure we have a lot of people from Connecticut, but we always have people from all over the country, sometimes all over the world. If you want to put in the chat where you're tuning in from and or what brought you here today, please talk away. We're about halfway there in terms of our viewers. So let's just let a couple more people come in. Yeah, if you have anything to say it in the chat. It is open for everyone. And we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. Thank you so much for joining us for this virtual program for The Rebellious CEO by Ralph Nader. First, I want to thank our sponsors. Our virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring the late Frank Lord. We are happy to honor his memory with these programs, and we are also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting all of our virtual programs. Please consider supporting our museum by becoming a member if you're not. All members receive free admission to our author programs, the House and Museum, year-round discounts in the store and cafe, and much more. You can visit our website for more information about membership. Now on to our guests. Our author, Ralph Nader, is a consumer advocate and author. He was named by The Atlantic as one of the 100 most influential figures in American history, and by Time and Life magazines as one of the 100 most influential Americans of the 20th century. Ralph Nader and the dozens of citizen groups he has founded have helped us drive safer cars, eat healthier food, breathe better air, drink cleaner water, and work in safer workplaces. Nader continues to be a relentless advocate for grassroots activism, more civic organizations, and democratic change for a just society. Our moderator, Erica E. Phillips, is an award-winning business and economics journalist. She currently covers economic development for the nonprofit Connecticut Mirror and writes the biweekly newsletter On Balance about the Connecticut economy. She has worked at American Public Media's Marketplace and the Los Angeles Bureau of the Wall Street Journal. Now, during this event, we encourage you to have a conversation with each other in the chat. But if you have a specific question, just put that into the Q&A. There's a button for it on the bottom left of your screen. So if you could just put your questions there, that'd be great. And that is all from me. Please sit back and enjoy, and I'll turn this over to Ralph and Erica.
Thanks, Omar, and thanks to all of you out there joining us today. I think we're going to have a good conversation here with our guest about a handful of corporate leaders. And let's just say our angle today isn't one we've commonly heard from Mr. Nader, also known as America's toughest consumer over the years. Today, we're talking about CEOs who did it right, as he calls them rebels. Mr. Nader, hello, it's nice to be speaking to you today.
Very good, thank you.
Now, just to set up our conversation, as you say in the introduction of the book, the elite group of chief executives you shine a light on here led companies ranging from the Vanguard Group Mutual Fund to Chun King Food Products to Busboys and Poets restaurants in the DC area. You write that each of them, quote, gave us a sense of what might have been and what still could be if business were rigorously framed as a process that was not only about making money and selling things, but about reducing damage and improving our social and natural world, unquote. I'll have some more specific questions about a few of these friends of yours, but first, tell us about what led you to write this book.
Well, it's long overdue, Erica. I've had an opportunity to meet a lot of CEOs or read about them or criticize them, challenge them, sometimes sue them. And we have a very serious problem with the CEOs of these giant corporations. They're not behaving properly. There's a corporate crime wave. Look at the opioid tragedies, for example, the Boeing tragedies, the many things that the Wall Street Journal and others have written about. And these CEOs have now so dominated their own companies that they often enrich themselves by stock buybacks that aren't productive and other ways against the interests of their own company. And they are also more powerful than ever. They have stripped the shareholders of any meaningful rights. Shareholders own the company. They're supposed to be working for them. And they just think of shareholder value. And they dominate the areas that they're selling products and services with fewer and fewer giant corporations. A lot of mergers, acquisitions, less and less competition. And for example, the military-industrial complex, pharmaceutical industry, the big food processors, Wall Street brokerage firms and banks, and the health insurance companies. So the question is, how do you evaluate them? They all say they're just meeting market demand, get off their back, get less regulation, and give them more tax breaks. And that's not enough of a framework. So over the years, I've met CEOs of companies who had a completely different business model. They started out with a vision of what they wanted to sell and make a profit. And then they started back and said, this is how we're going to treat our workers and our consumers and our environment and our civic concerns in order to make a profit. Not here's the formula for the profit. It will make all these other people adjust to maximizing the profits, the bonuses, and the executive compensation. So where these top CEOs are now paying themselves 300 to 500 times more than the medium wage of workers in their own company, these CEOs did not overpay themselves. The founder of Southwest Airlines, Herb Kelleher, he was the lowest paid CEO by far among the giant airlines, and he made far more profit than any of the giant airlines. In fact, Delta went bankrupt, for example, and other companies were on the edge, but Southwest was making a profit every year because they had a CEO that put his people first. He never said employees or associates. And if they treat his people first, they'll treat customers, airline passengers to fly more on Southwest, and they'll make the shareholders happy. So he started with the workers, not the shareholders. He completely reversed the business model. And that's what a lot of these other companies, CEOs did, like Anita Roddick of the Body Shop, the great Ray Anderson of the Interface Corporation, which is the biggest carpet tile manufacturer in the world out of Atlanta, Georgia. And he completely reinvented the company starting in 1994 to become carbon neutral. And it hit the target in 2018 rather, and now is going for carbon negative. So you can see they just reversed the business model. They didn't give the excuse, we put out all these ads and the customers liked them and they bought our product. Never mind that so many of these ads are inflated and deceptive and manipulative. So that's why I wrote this book, to provide alternative yardsticks, alternative frameworks, alternative ways of evaluating the CEOs of the big corporations, because these CEOs made profit. They met the bottom line. They did all these other things in such a wonderful way to be an example for these corporations that are astride the world.
Yeah, and I encourage other people to read it. It was an entertaining and enlightening read. You incorporate a lot of primary source material in the book, quoting from writings, interviews, and lectures. And that was particularly helpful in getting at what was one of the main ideas of the book, which is showing how these people think. Because this is where they stand out, right? To your point just now. And one theme that kept coming up was their willingness, the willingness on the part of these leaders to consider a new approach, a different approach, as you said, alternative yardsticks. It seems simple, but that can be pretty uncommon in the corporate world. You described Saul Price, who founded Price Club, which inspired and eventually merged with the juggernaut we know as Costco. And Ray Anderson of Interface, you just mentioned just now, you describe them both as rethinkers. And in Anderson's case, you can actually measure the impact of that rethinking pretty directly that it had on the environment. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more deeply about Ray Anderson's story and what Interface did.
Well, Ray Anderson started this company himself. He was an engineer in his 30s, and he ran this company for 2, 3 decades. And he went to a lecture once by Paul Hawken, who is in this book as a CEO. Hawken had written the best-selling book called The Ecology of Commerce, which it was basically tutoring business executives saying, you got to get on board on this environmental situation because it's destroying the earth. It's reflecting a lot of waste on your part. Air pollution is an example of wasteful, inefficient use of energy or excessive packaging or whatever. And he came back to his office in Atlanta. He was completely transformed. And he said to his associates, we're going to change this company from top to bottom. And he did it year by year, as you say. He had measurements where they used less water, they used less chemicals, they required their suppliers to be more environmentally astute. And it was very meticulous, actually. He had charts and all kinds of variables involved. And every year they reduce cost and make more profit, reduce costs and make more profit. Till 2019, as I said, when they announced they went carbon neutral, and now they're going carbon negative. The Yvon Chouinard of Patagonia, some of your viewers now, I'm sure, have bought some of the outdoor equipment and outdoor clothing of Patagonia. This is an extraordinary company. He never went public, so he doesn't worry about Wall Street badgering them about next quarterly earnings. The family owned the company, and he would actually urge his customers not to buy his products if they can get more use out of the products they bought earlier from Patagonia. They could repair them, for example. In fact, it had a van that went around the country showing people how to repair things instead of just throwing them away as disposables. And he treated his workers so well. His first book was Let My People Surf. Well, you know, his headquarters is on the Pacific Ocean, a little south of Santa Barbara. And he would urge them to go surfing at lunchtime. He would urge them to pursue their environmental causes, often on time.
Just fact checking you, that's true. I've been there. I've interviewed folks at the site, and the ocean is just right there. And lunchtime, they're all just on their way over there. So, yeah, it's not just a story. It's absolutely true. My next question was about Yvon and also Anita Roddick, who I read, you know, when reading the book. Anita Roddick was the founder of The Body Shop. Yvon Chouinard, of course, of Patagonia. And they're true activists. They had this unique way of aligning their activism with their company's marketing. And they've encouraged employees to speak freely about the causes they cared about. We're seeing that more and more in the last few years. Companies kind of taking a stand on social issues, environmental issues. Do you think companies these days are following Roddick and Chouinard's examples well? Do you think they could do better? Tell us about that sort of activism streak.
Well, he thinks they can do better. And of course, so do I, because we still have ExxonMobil in the fossil fuel industry, oil, gas, coal, nuclear industry. They're still very powerful in Washington. We're not moving fast enough to renewable or solar or wind power, even though the price of renewable energy now is much lower than the prices of coal and oil and gas. So, you know, while it's very encouraging to see the spread of renewable energy in our country and around the world. It's not going fast enough. The planet is running out of time, as we can see from the melting glaciers, horrendously more virulent floods, droughts, wildfires, hurricanes, rising sea level. Chenard just retired recently. He gave the company to a trust, which is being run by his former managers in perpetuity. And he still advises them, but basically there's a continuity of the public philosophy described in one of his books called The Responsible Corporation, which I urge anybody to read. Nader invented her company right from the bottom up. I mean, she basically said, look, corporations are the most powerful institution in the world, and they have to take into consideration the well-being of the community, neighborhood, the area around them that they're operating in. And she practiced what she preached. And she did just that. And she almost insisted that her workers pick a cause that they feel strongly about, a civic justice cause, and work on it on company time. She'd allow environmental groups to put placards and posters in her stores. She'd go to indigenous tribes around the world for her supplies and develop a very respectful, instead of usurping, policy of purchasing these raw materials. For instance, she once heard that there was a huge orphanage where the babies were dying in Romania after the collapse of the communist regime, and saw pictures of it. She took a crew and flew to Romania and put money in, cleaned up the whole area, provided health care for the children and the babies, and left a permanent trust to further that when she returned back to London. She's an extraordinary person. She went to Angola jail with civil rights people in Louisiana to try to free the imprisoned people there. They were put in solitary confinement for over 40 years, and they were railroaded. They weren't given due process and a fair trial. And there she was, right there. She participated in this group called the Social Venture Network, with Ben and Jerry's and Esprit and other mid-sized companies focusing on civic engagement and the using of corporate power for just ends. So there are others. There's Gordon Sherman of the Midas Muffler franchise. He was overthrown by his own father, who took control of the company. But before he was evicted, because he was too progressive, he started a major public interest law firm in Chicago, which continues doing its good deeds every day now. And there's each one of these CEOs had a different personality, Erica, but they had common characteristics. And one of them was they admitted their mistakes in public. Gino Paolucci would immediately tell people why some of his restaurants failed and had to close down.
Gino struck me as quite a character, and I think I have a question for you about him later on, or we can talk a little bit about him, because he just seemed like a force. I did want to, speaking of kind of things that a lot of these executives shared in common, another theme that emerged from nearly every one of the profiles that you wrote was the importance to these leaders that their employees be fairly compensated and treated well. And many of them were big supporters of unions. And that jumped out at me as a business journalist, because so often I hear from companies and business groups that labor is their number one cost, and they can't remain profitable if, for example, the minimum wage is raised, or they have to offer better benefits to recruit new hires. So it's unusual to hear company executives who speak out in support of labor unions.
Here's a couple examples for you. And by the way, the CEOs you mentioned who are such concerned about wages in their workplace, they don't apply that to themselves. When I was a kid, the CEOs of the Fortune 500 paid themselves 12 to 14 times the median wage of workers in their companies. Now it's 300 to 500 times, sometimes 1,000 times. So they don't practice what they preach. The insurance companies are notorious for being non-union or anti-union. And the head of the American Income Life Insurance Company out of Waco, Texas, who's one of the CEOs in the book, Bo Rappaport, not only favored unions, not only broke new marketing opportunities by selling life insurance to unions, which no life insurance companies ever did, but he insisted on having a union in his company and he joined it. And Gino Paolucci insisted on having unions in all his companies. He'd start companies and sell them off. And he not only insisted that they have unions, but he loved to bargain with them. And he never had a strike in 50 years, not one strike. So as you indicated, Erica, these are wonderful examples today for business students, millions of them who take business courses or go to business school or undergraduate majors who don't have in their curriculum profiles of these kinds of CEOs who challenge the market fundamentalism rationale of big business. And basically they're saying, we're making profit. We want to have our workers have fun and enjoy their work with decent livelihoods. And we're going to be good for consumers as well. And it's very important that this book be part of their curriculum of business schools. And we're trying to call business deans around the country, Yale, Quinnipiac, UConn, for example, in Connecticut, to give them an awareness of this book. And as you say, it has wonderful quotes. John Bogle, who revolutionized the mutual fund industry by starting Vanguard, which was not a stock company. So he got Wall Street off his back. It was a mutual company where technically investors own a piece of the company. And he was a marvel. Not only did he write a lot and speak a lot, but he produced a mutual fund that had much lower fees than Fidelity and others, much more responsive on the telephone, for example, on emails, and he developed a large arc of concern. He was concerned about underfunded pension plans, public and private. And he was concerned that the investors were being squeezed with too many fees and too much speculative choices for their investment by the managers of the mutual fund, undermining the stability of pension funds, for example, or ordinary investors for that matter. But he was so, I got to read you his sentence. When people would say, oh, look how brilliant you are. And he said, I credit my success such as it is, not to brilliance or complexity, but to common sense and simplicity. Common sense and simplicity. And for all of you who are tired of fine print contract complicity and all the complexities that you face when you try to find out about your consumer status or well-being or rights, here's what he said, quote, mark me down, too, as an adversity of complexity that obfuscates and confuses, complexity that comes hand in hand with costs that serve its creators and marketeers, not the investors. End quote. So the book cannot be done justice to by just summarizing it, because it's the quotes, as you pointed out. Yeah. It's their remarkable candor. They didn't care that they took controversial views. They didn't care that businesses would come down on them. They basically viewed themselves as free human beings, as people who have every right to express themselves in free speech. Both Saul Price and Bo Rappaport were Jewish Americans, and yet they supported educational projects in Palestine, job development projects in Palestine, and in his exchange of letters with the mayor of Jerusalem, Teddy Kollek, is quoted in the book. He says he wants, Saul Price said he wants to develop a dialogue between Palestinians and Israelis, and he wants to be very candid, and he doesn't expect his candor to be exposed to charges of anti-Semitism, which simply dampen the free exchange for coexistence peacefully between the two groups. Now, when he said that, he got a lot of pushback from his business friends. How dare you say this? How dare you support the Palestinians? He was completely unfazed. These people in the book, these CEOs, had strong temperaments, but they weren't arrogant. Strong temperaments, very tolerant to diversity of views. And it's interesting, Erica, every one of them had a stable family relationship.
Right.
It's
You
quite
mentioned that,
remarkable, given the pressure on them, the dog eat dog industries they were in, the 7 day a week effort like Keller had to do to get Southwest through all the rules and regulations. They came from stable families, which means that they weren't distracted emotionally. They could focus, and by the way, they focused meticulously on their profits. They basically said,
That
without
was
profits, we can't do everything we want to do.
yes, you got to my next question before me, but yeah, all of these characteristics we're talking about, all of this willingness to put yourself out there, to rethink things, to be called on your decisions and have to reevaluate them, all of that's wonderful, wonderful characteristics. But all of these leaders also, um, the bottom line still mattered to them, right? Nothing would have been possible for any of them without paying attention to how profitable their companies were. So, yeah, I wanted to have you maybe mention a CEO or two who made that point most adamantly. Who do you think of on that point particularly?
Well, one of the most brilliant critics of corporations was Gordon Sherman. He was a classic major at University of Chicago, and he carried with the wisdom of the ancients with him all his life. And he had over 600 franchise Midas muffler shops in the U.S. and around the world. And he told me that I pay attention to profits, and I'm not going to squeeze my dealers the way franchise agreements do, but I'm going to try to hire PhDs in classics to run the dealerships. And he did a number of that. And all these CEOs made work fun. They tried to say, look, I mean, that's a big part of your life, friend, and it should be enjoyable. You should be able to take your conscience to work every day and not leave your conscience at home. Of course, they did exactly that. They took their conscience to work. So they all paid very strong attention to their profits, but they didn't overpay themselves. Herb Kelleher was the lowest paid CEO of all the major airlines by far.
This is Southwest Airlines, just
yeah, Southwest Airlines. Sorry, he basically was paid $750,000. Other CEOs of United and Delta, they were paying millions of dollars a year. And while they were losing money, he was making profit year after year after year. One year, he made more profit than all the other four major airlines together. One of the airlines, like Delta, went bankrupt. So they saw profits as the fountain of what they could want to do with their business. But they didn't make profits tyrannize the way they treated their workers or cut corners in their selling products and services to consumers.
And I think in Kelleher's case, the sort of positive workplace culture that he, was such a big proponent of, he attributed the company's success to that, right? He kind of made that connection between, well, the people who work here are happy, and therefore the customers are happy, and so there was a real connection there between the how he treated his employees and the success of the company. At least he made that connection.
And he gave employees stocks.
Right.
When their work got more passengers to use Southwest Airlines, it made the shareholders happy. And the workers who were unionized in Southwest benefited from their stock. I mean, one time, Herb gives this little story. He was at an airport, and a Southwest worker tapped him on the shoulder and said, can I talk to you for a few minutes? And he said, yeah. And so she took him over to a corner near the counter. And he said, Herb, I'm a little worried about the stock coming down. My stock is down to $1.3 million. He loved to give that example. And that was, when 1.3 million was worth like 3 million today.
And you just think about the contrast of, an employee telling the executive that, not a shareholder. That's really powerful, I think.
Well, he was hands-on. Sometimes he would actually become a steward on the plane just to get the feel for what it was like. And that's another feature. They went down to where the selling was. They didn't just be in a cocoon in executive suite surrounded by sycophants. They went down to where the actual interactions were. I'll give you another example. United Airlines executive left, CEO, and he went to work as CEO of the successor to Allegheny Air, U.S. Air. And I used to make my airline reservations at night because they always put you on hold. How they break, the music, and then they'll say, well, hold on, your business is important to us. It got so routine that if I wanted to hear classical music, I would dial United Airlines.
You knew which kind of music between the two airlines, right?
And so I called up the CEO of U.S. Air, and I said, have you ever tried to make a reservation on your airline? He said, no, I have my staff do it. I said, well, here's my experience. Why don't you pick up the phone next time you're traveling and make your own reservations and see what it's like? So he said, yeah, okay. So about 3-4 weeks later, he calls back and he says, you understated how long it was. It was so terrible. I've hired 250 more people to staff the phones. So these CEOs were very, very much down to earth. And one nice thing about them is they didn't whine about regulation. I'm always listening to these companies whining about overregulation. Well, the reason why they didn't whine about regulations, they were ahead of the regulations. Like Interface Corporation would laugh at the standards that EPA requires. They're way ahead of them. And that's another thing that shows the self-possession and the vision that these CEOs embodied, that they were very creative. Only a few of them proselytized their peers. Ray Anderson actually made about 100 speeches a year to business people and conventions. He'd go to Walmart and say, look at all this excess packaging for your products. Get rid of it, and you'll save your expenses and improve the environment. And they accepted it. And they found, it reduced our expenses. He was a proselytizer. But a lot of the others, they were not interested in that. They were not interested in conglomerates and buying into other industries. They just wanted to shine in the business that they started.
There's one business leader that stood out to me. I wanted to ask you about Andy Shalal, the founder of Busboys and Poets, which is a group of restaurants, bookstores, and event spaces in the Washington, D.C. area. I thought he was a unique inclusion in the book, and his example speaks to the importance of a business's connection to its community, and what you wrote, using business as a tool for social change. And it struck me that Andy's work to foster civic engagement is probably very aligned with your values, and I just wanted to see if you'd share with us the story of Busboys and Poets.
Yeah, the title comes from one of Langston Hughes's poems, Busboys and Poets. He has 8 restaurants in Washington and the environs. He's been asked to set up in New York City and Denver and elsewhere. He said, I'm not going to become a big chain. I've got my hands full here in Washington. And he broke the model of restaurants. You walk into his restaurant, very artistic, by the way. He would make the murals himself of civil rights struggles on the walls of the restaurant. You walk in, there's an open bookstore, and then there's a dining area, and where people can look at the cooks and so forth preparing the meals. And then there's a civic room where you'd have poetry recitals, you'd have politicians talking policy, you'd have debates between candidates, you'd have civic leaders making presentations. C-SPAN would often cover them. And, he turned his restaurants into community centers. They were immediately multiracial. He never had to advertise because he was so active in the community in all kinds of mediations between conflicting groups, for example, or he would engage in peace marches in front of the White House. When the French started their nuclear tests up again in 1995, he publicly poured French wine down the drain in protest. He would have famous authors like Howard Zinn at his bookstores. He got so much word of mouth publicity, he never had to advertise at all. So he saved all that money just the way Nader Roddick never had to advertise and poured it back into the business model that he was pursuing. Now, he has an extraordinarily stable temperament and a very pleasing personality. And he doesn't mind if he's criticized. He wants dialogue. And it's amazing how little publicity these CEOs got, Erica. That's one reason I wanted to write this book, because the bad guys often get publicity. They get exposed on 60 Minutes or other newspapers and magazines. But good news doesn't seem to be news enough for PBS and NPR and the commercial television stations. And it's very important to raise people's morale in a very depressed time. Very important to raise their expectation levels about what business can be like and should be like, and not give excuses that you're just giving the market what the market demands. Tobacco, vaping, opiates, junk food, junk drink. These markets are shaped by advertisers who are now reaching the young at a very young age. Direct marketing, which is unheard of when I was young. Direct marketing undermining and bypassing parental authority day after day after day through the cell phone and the computer and TV. They are not just responding to external market disciplines. They are creating these markets in an extremely harmful way. I think one of the regrets I have in this book is that many of these CEOs have already passed away. We've lost their leadership, and we're looking for their successors, because when you see what the wardens of the internet are doing to our kids, seducing them and addicting them 5 to 7 hours a day on that iPhone, separating them from their families, their community, their nature. Parents are losing control of their own kids. This is a great abduction. These companies are merciless, regardless of what their rhetoric publicly. They want more time from these kids on the internet, so that they give them more personal information that they sell to advertisers, so they can be exposed to ads like junk food and junk drink and violent programming to maximize the profits of Facebook, now called Meta, Google, and of course all the other food companies and drink companies. Now they're teaching them how to gamble from home. It's not enough to putting food to increase obesity and youthful diabetes, etc. Now they want internet gambling.
Right. So to your point, so this book presented us with a group of leaders, many of whom have passed on, as you've said, who set an example, and you envisioned business school students reading this book and having some examples of kind of being that sort of open thinker and trying out these new yardsticks. And that's important because so often what you see is the negative examples and the problems that are arising from businesses, as you just described, who maybe are the latest examples of going after young people for their time and so on. But I had wanted to ask whether there are any younger business leaders, up and coming corporate executives that you have your eye on who embody the rebellious spirit of the subjects in this book. Is anyone coming along that we should be paying attention to, that journalists should be paying attention to, for example?
Well, nothing like these CEOs, although, I'm not aware of everything that's going on. Excuse me, we have a lot of small businesses who really do it right in communities. You know them, you patronize them all over the country. But these were sizable businesses, not giant, but sizable businesses. And if you read Inc. magazine and Fast Forward, you'll read a lot about entrepreneurial breakthroughs and innovation, but they seem to be so busy with their breakthroughs, innovation, and then they often sell to the larger companies, their own company, that they don't have a record of decades the way these CEOs have. Now, there are companies who have slices of their activities that are very commendable. And they do get press for some things they do philanthropically or creatively and helping a depressed area in their city and things like that. But I'm waiting for some examples. Now, there is a group called Businesses for Social Responsibility, and they're supposed to have a number of these CEOs. But the trouble is that a lot of them sold out to other companies. Ben & Jerry's, for example, sold out to a Dutch conglomerate. They still produce the ice cream with the quirky names and all, but it's not what it was like when Ben & Jerry's were in charge. And so in answer to your question, we're looking for them.
Mm-hmm.
There are always slices of companies that are doing it right, but these, more than any that I've ever seen, are the complete product, so to speak. They insisted that their entire company was going to be run according to a set of principles.
That seems like a great way to kind of wrap up your and my conversation, and maybe open it up to the audience here if anyone has any more questions. Omar, if you don't mind getting back on and helping me field some of this Q&A, that would be excellent. So fire away, audience. It's great having you here. Let's hear your questions.
Sorry about that. All right, let's see what we have here. Anthony says, Mr. Nader went public with his difficulty in finding a publisher for this book. Can you tell us about how he overcame his obstacles and achieved success in finally finding a publisher?
Well, that's a very important point you made. I sent this to maybe 20, 25 publishers, and back came the answer, we don't think it would sell, which is really a reflection of our culture of low expectation levels or discouragement or whatever, or cynicism. And I finally found a small publisher, Melville House in New York City. They said, yeah, this should be a great book for people who want yardsticks, want good yardsticks. They want standards by which to evaluate corporations other than this free market fundamentalism mythology that is peddled. And I think they also saw it could be a part of a curriculum in business school and undergraduate business major courses around the country. But the rejection was so prominent. All the major publishers, Simon Schuster, Random House, Alfred Knopf, it was so uniform that a reporter who covers the publishing industry for the Wall Street Journal wrote an article about it. He says, this is really extraordinary. all these years I'm criticizing corporations. Now I'm praising a number of them. It should be counterintuitively interesting to people. So we finally got Melville House to put it out, and it's in hardback, and it'll be on Kindle, of course, and other ways to get a hold of it. You can get more information about it by going to nader.org. That's simple enough.
William asks, CEOs report to the board of directors. He has a couple questions here. How many boards are on board with the approach you espouse? And how do we convert those who are not, especially considering that boards are heterogeneous? Also, for CEOs who want to adopt your approach, how can they go about bringing the board on board?
Well, the way corporations are now structured, top down, very much concentrated power in executive suites. The CEO and president are often the same person, not a good idea, and the executive vice presidents at that level. And they control the board. The board doesn't control them. They choose the people who are going to be put on the board. They pretty much define their own salaries and compensation packages, and they reward the board sort of a payola, like on Boeing during the aftermath of the horrible crashes in Indonesia and Ethiopia, which took the life of my grandniece, Samia, who is an emerging leader in global health. We found out that the board, which is rubber stamping the corner cutting of Boeing executives that led to the crashes of the 737 MAX, the board members were making $330,000 each a year just for a few meetings and briefings. So there's a lot of payola. So it all is down to the CEO and the president. And the other question was, how do you get boards to adopt this? Well, you have to have independent board members. And a lot of the so-called independent board members become very dependent on their remuneration and being wined and dined and not having to do much sweat work in being the ultimate governing body of these giant corporations. And so the way to start is with new companies, with new boards that are the result of the vision of the entrepreneur that started the company, the way is described here in the book. The boards of directors of these companies were very much attuned to Ray Anderson and Saul Price, Bo Rappaport, John Bogle, and others. And the question is, can this business model be repeated if the model was not part of the founding person? Most of these companies were the work of founders who stayed with it for years and decades. And I say the business model is replicable in large companies. It doesn't. They don't have to be governed by their founders. And I think Ray Anderson proved that. He showed these large corporations how, in the long run, it's their own survival as that of the planet with global warming, violence, and the rest. In the short run, they're foolish not to follow these models because they cut costs and increase profits in a beneficial way. They don't just cut costs on the back of their workers and increase profits by gouging consumers and cheating them.
We have a couple of questions about specific people. Anthony asks, do you have any thoughts on Sam Bankman-Fried, the disgraced CEO of FTX, the cryptocurrency exchange?
Well, he was a big-time gambler. That's what cryptocurrency is. It's a way to circumvent international and national laws. There's a lot of underworld and money laundering through cryptocurrency. The Washington Post, which has covered cryptocurrency in its business pages extensively, just came out with an editorial saying cryptocurrency is on the edge. Good riddance. It shouldn't even exist. If you want to deal with what its alleged beneficial purpose is, digital dollars will do the job. That was the editorial. So this man was a speculator. When you are a speculator and you're surrounded by secrecy, which he was, you get tempted to cross the line, to break the law, to cheat your investors, to enrich yourself unlawfully. And so he's gotten into trouble in that way. The CEOs in this book were just the opposite of secrecy. Saul Price would actually share his ways of building his big box store with his competitors, Sam's Club, for example, and Costco learned from him. They didn't like trade secrets. If they found a good way to do business, they wanted everybody in the business sector that they were in to know about it.
There's also a question, actually from the same person. He says, I'm in Cleveland where one of your featured CEOs, Peter Lewis, started Progressive Insurance. What's your favorite Peter Lewis story?
Well, he was my classmate at Princeton, where he was rather shy, I thought. He became very flamboyant. And one of my favorite stories is he called up once and said, let's have lunch. I'm in Washington. He took a great interest in auto safety. It was an auto insurance company, after all, among other insurance. And in one lunch, I convinced him to convert his large auto fleet with airbags. Well, there is some advantage of having a classmate who is the CEO of a large company, and whatever he says goes. And he converted. And then I had another lunch with him, and he said, you criticize our companies in the insurance area as if they're not competitive. What do you mean they're not competitive? We're fighting like cats and dogs here against one another. I said, yeah, you're fighting against one another, but you're not fighting for maximizing consumer well-being and adequately priced services. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, you put a lot of money in your ads, don't you, Peter? He said, yeah. I said, why don't you do comparative pricing? Why don't you say, for the same set of details for a prospective policyholder, here's what Progressive charges, and here's what Allstate, State Farm, and Nationwide, your major competitors, charge. He did it. To this day, they have comparative pricing. And when Progressive doesn't come up first, too bad. He doesn't remove the ad. There are a lot of funny stories about Peter. He commissioned a very expensive architect to build a huge mansion in Cleveland. And I think after millions of dollars, Peter either said he was going to donate it to the city or he wasn't going to finish it. Maybe the caller knows. But when the New York Times asked him, hey, what are you going to do with this? Is costing you a lot of money. He said, yeah, I know, but I'm very rich. But the best story of all, when he was put on the board of trustees of Princeton University, he had blood clotting problems. He lost a leg, and he learned to use medical marijuana for his pain. And I said, well, congratulations on being on the board of trustees for Princeton, your alma mater. How was it? He said, well, when they were doing due diligence on me to decide if they were going to invite me on, they classified me as a functional pothead. Indeed, he gave him $200 million afterwards. That's quite a functional pothead.
There's also a question. It's a little bit away from the subject of the book, but just want to bring it up. David Coleman says, great talk, Ralph. I worked for you at Congress Watch with Mark Green in the late 70s.
Wow.
Congress seemed to work more or less back then. Now it's totally dysfunctional. What happened?
What happened is the people back home lost interest in their civic obligations.
Mm.
And the companies didn't. They kept pumping money into campaigns to defeat good members of Congress, especially in the bloodbath of 1980 when Reagan swept Carter and took down Senator Warren Magnuson, Senator Gaylord Nelson, Senator Frank Church, and many other stalwarts. And gradually, year by year, Congress was replaced with corporatists, people who thought corporations should get the prime share in our democracy, should have superior advantages, benefits, handouts, bailouts, tax breaks, coddling corporations, not enforcing the corporate criminal laws, the consumer environmental worker laws, anti-labor. All that we see has come to a rancid concentration in Congress. So we have to start all over again. And it's very easy to do. I wrote a book called Breaking Through Power. It's easier than we think. And here's why it's easy. Congress is the most important branch of government, first among equals. Obviously, it funds the executive branch and the judicial branch and confirms nominations, has a taxing power, the spending power, the war power, but it is given up a lot of these authorities under the Constitution to the White House, no matter who's president. We've written booklets on the surrender of Congress, turning itself into an ink blot, rubber stamping the huge, wasteful military budget, developing a system of corporate welfare that I call government guaranteed big capitalism. If they get in trouble, they don't go bankrupt, they go to Washington for a bailout, like General Motors did. So now back home, people are depressed, discouraged, they're not complaining as much as they should, according to a New York Times poll. Okay, so let's look at it this way. The people have the sovereignty under our Constitution. So the preamble starts, we the people, not we the corporation or we the Congress. Okay, so people start with a pretty powerful asset. It's called the constitutional sovereign power. They give this power under certain conditions to 535 members of Congress, senators and representatives. Are there Congress watch groups and congressional districts all over the country, supported by vigorous volunteers and a few full-time staff? Zero. Anybody working back home to at least make the military budget auditable? It's violating federal law since 1992. The only department doesn't provide Congress with an audited budget. Zero. Is there anybody or any group around the country making Congress change the tax laws so that they start taxing instead of undertaxing the super rich and the global corporations? Is zero. Zero. These are democracy deserts. And there's no reason why we don't learn the lessons of American history, which has never taken more than 1% of a committed, organized citizenry to defeat corporate power or bigotry in the civil rights movement, for example, and prevail in Congress. Never taken more than 1%. We got the auto industry regulated in 1966, the biggest industry at the time, with less than 1,000 people around the country and media coverage. How? Well, first of all, we knew what we were talking about in discussing unsafe cars by make and model. No seatbelts, no airbags, no padded, no rollover protection, and inadequate brakes and tires, and so on. Second, we had most of the people on our side. You want to protect their kids, if no one else. They wanted safe cars and trucks. And third, did we just have rallies on a weekend where the energy went up into the ether? No. We focused on who's going to make the decision. They make the industry build safer cars. Congress, senator by senator, the key chairs of the committees. Senator Magnuson agrees with you. That means it's going to go through committee and the Senate. That's how powerful he was. And in less than a year, we went from 0 votes in Congress to regulate the auto companies to unanimous House and Senate vote signed by Lyndon Johnson, who gave me a pen at the White House. What am I saying? That a very small number of people representing public opinion, and we have a lot of left-right support for so many things, contrary to the ruling group's divide and rule tactics in Washington, red state, blue state. They all bleed the same way against corporate defective products, hazardous pharmaceuticals, flammable fabrics, ripoffs. Doesn't matter whether you're conservative, liberal family, you bleed the same color. And so we've got to realize how fast we can turn Congress around for universal health insurance, like all other Western countries have, free choice of doctor and hospital, much more efficient. None of these complex bills and codes, etc. None of those denial of benefit here and there by health insurance companies arbitrarily, and a living wage, cracking down on corporate crooks, changing the tax system, expanding public budgets to put the tax dollars back to improving public works and services in the community, de-bloating the military budget that's blowing up infrastructure around the world instead of rebuilding and modernizing it here. All these have left-right support, 70, 80%, but there's no organization back home except certain single-issue people like NRA, AIPAC, anti-abortion, pro-reproductive rights. They have a few of those, and they make their demands quite clear on Capitol Hill. But on all these other unifying issues, for clean elections, over 80% of the Republicans polled oppose the Supreme Court decision, Citizens United, that allowed companies to give as much money as they want against or for local state political candidates running for office. Over 80% of the Republicans. So let's get rid of this excessive polarization stuff and get down to where people live, work, and raise their families. And they often want exactly the same thing. They want decently provided public services, roads, bridges, public transit, good public schools, civic education. They want all these things. But if we allow ourselves to be divided and ruled, we will get so discouraged that we will really basically surrender our sovereign power to 535 people in Congress and then the legislators at the state level. It all starts with the one branch of government that we can control most readily, and we have the vote power over it. And that's the state legislatures, the local town councils, and the Congress. Remember that book? It's called Breaking Through Power. It's Easier We Think. And the novel factor there, it has a formal summons where people get names on a petition, clearly written with occupation, profession, email, and they summon the senators and representatives without any flacks or intermediaries to town meetings where the people set the agenda. And they give advance notice to the senators and representatives about the topics so they can get up to speed and not say, oh, we'll look at it later. This is unfamiliar to me. Summon them to your town meetings. Reverse the dynamic because you are the sovereign and they're supposed to work for you. And that's the whole spirit behind our new newspaper, Erica and Omar, called Capitol Hill Citizen. And people who get it, and it's in print only, we explain why, are just delighted that they're not distracted by the internet and when they're trying to read something. It's called Capitol Hill Citizen, and it's 40 pages when it comes out. The current one just came out a few days ago. Go to capitolcitizen.com, and for $5 or more, if you wish, you can get a copy. It's 40 pages, packed with material, and also shows how you can become a Capitol Hill citizen. It empowers you as well as informs you and your circle and your local book clubs and your neighborhood meetings. CapitolCitizen.com.
Great. Thank you so much, Ralph. This has been amazing. And thank you so much, Erica, for moderating today.
Thanks for having me, Ralph. Thanks for the great conversation. And for everyone who tuned in, thanks a lot for listening. This was really fun.
Wonderful. And I put links in the chat to buy Ralph's book. Yeah, thank you for joining us. And please join us again in the future. Have a great day.
All right, take care.
Thank you.